They call it the shareable economy, a collaborative economy that runs parallel to the regular economy and consists of bartering, exchanging, renting, trading, leasing, and swapping of goods, services, time, capital, space, and businesses, all sustained by new mobile and digital technologies. And joining us now to talk about the possibilities behind this shareable economy in Vancouver, British Columbia, Vanessa Timmer. She is Executive Director and co-founder of One Earth. And Vanessa, we're happy to have you on TVO tonight. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Steve.
Glad to hear it. Well, we just gave a bit of a definition about what the shareable or collaborative rather, economy is. Could you tell us off the top, how big is this?
Well, you know, Steve, I was quite surprised. I went across Canada with April Rinne, who's the Chief Strategy Officer for the Collaborative Lab, just in February of 2014. And we went across Canada and really looked at what this shareable or collaborative economy is. And it astounded me. It's at the moment a $110 billion industry around the world. And Forbes is actually estimating that it's growing at about 25% a year. And when we traveled with it was actually a tour launching Cities for People, which is an experiment on making cities better, as well as with the social innovation generation. And we did find that there were social innovations happening across Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver, the places we stopped, and actually across Canada. There's immense innovation happening in the collaborative economy and sharing economy space.
I guess my follow-up is, how do you know? Because if you loan me your lawnmower and I loan you my car for the day, who's to know about that except for you and me?
You know, you make a great point, Steve, because some of this is monetized, so you can actually track it in, for example, you know, in the sectors of transportation, we can look at car sharing and see that in Toronto, AutoShare started with 12 members and now, or 16 members, and now is 12,000 members. So we see the numbers there, the growth. In Airbnb, which is a peer-to-peer marketplace for accommodation. We can see it grow in the last 5 years from zero to, in Canada, for example, in Toronto, there's about 1,000 places where people put up for people to rent out their space. But there's also, as you say, much of that, this is kind of more exchange that isn't monetized, but we can still track some of it. So if you look at Airbnb, it's actually exchanging money, but couch surfing, which is also grown rapidly in the last 5 years. In fact, Airbnb and couchsurfing are bigger than any hotel chain now, just in the last 5 years. The couchsurfing doesn't exchange any money. So we actually see that some of this is monetized, some of it is non-monetized. And as you say, some of it's happening just as we've always done, sharing between neighbors, between people in our office, just saying, hey, you're sending this across the country as a business. Can I put another load on the back of your truck? So some of it, you're right, we won't be able to track, but I have to say we're also seeing a lot of it showing up in real numbers across the different sectors.
Okay, those two things you just mentioned, couch surfing, I think I know. This is where people are basically all signed up to a particular site, and I've got a couch for you to flop on if you're coming through my country, you know, and I get to flop on your couch when I go traveling over in your country. I get that. What was the first thing you said?
It's Airbnb. So this is actually, it was started by two gentlemen in California when there was a big convention coming to town, and they ended up noticing that the hotels in the convention were, like all the hotels in San Francisco were actually filled up, and they said, well, why don't we just put an air mattress down on the ground and put an ad up? And they were amazed at how many people came to tell them they'd like to stay there and pay the money. So what ended up happening is they set up Airbnb as a place for people to rent out their spare room or perhaps their vacation house or different places. Sometimes it's even tree houses in the back of their property. And what's been really interesting is that a few things have been happening that it's just exploded. It's now 500,000 Airbnb accommodations, personal accommodations that people put up there that are being used in 192 countries and 34,000 cities. But the other thing that's really interesting about it is that it's actually provided people with some extra income, and it's been cheaper accommodation for places where it's often expensive to rent or to stay in a hotel. And the other interesting thing about it is that people build connections. So once someone stays within their home, we're finding that later when they visit, for example, another part of the world or another part of Canada, they'll look those people up again and say, hey, you stayed at my place, and
so
perhaps they'll stay at their place, or maybe they'll just become friends.
Yeah, friendships start as well.
So it's,
I saw something in the Globe and Mail a few months ago which talked about a lot of goods and services that essentially do nothing for much of the time. And we're going to put just a little chart here up for our viewers to see. You know these facts already, I'm sure. Every household in the developed world, it says, has on average $3,000 of unused items. Private cars sit unused 95% of the time, and vacation rental properties are only occupied about a third of the time. I guess this is something you refer to as idling capacity. You want to just help us with a bit of a better definition on that?
Yeah, and I actually think this is the key part of what we're talking about around the collaborative economy. We think about it in terms of the sharing and collaboration piece, but I think equally important is this concept of idling capacity. And this is the social, economic, environmental value of underutilized assets, or what businesses would call asset optimization, and what you and I might call basically the wasted resources, things that are just sitting in our basements and our homes. And you can think about it in terms of the $3,000 worth of things we might have sitting around, such as old children's clothes or tools, for example, that we use perhaps very briefly in its lifespan, and maybe how we can share some of those things. But we also can take that to the next level, because these assets don't just exist in households. We only use about, if we look at office space use, it's during office hours. April Renee from the Collaborative Lab was reminding me that office space during office hours is only occupied 65% of the time. So we're seeing that things like the Hive or the Hub, these shared office spaces are emerging, and people are starting to think about sharing, for example, supply spaces for industry. So these underutilized assets exist in our households, they exist within our offices, and we can also look at how they exist within our cities as a whole. So you can imagine, Steve, that we can start to look at our cities and think about what are these underutilized assets. We, of course, already share things through our civic assets like libraries and parks, but we can also start to think about how could those be used in different ways. Can we share backyards? Can we share common kitchens? Can we start to share idle time on supply chains? Can we start to think about how we might share larger tools, such as 3D printers that allow people to innovate in hacker spaces? So I think this is the exciting part of it, is this idling capacity that helps us actually look at gaining much more efficiency and reducing the amount of resources we use. And by the way, when we're sharing, often we do encounter other people, so we end up building that trust, that reciprocity, and those connections while we're actually becoming more financially and economically efficient.
And can I confirm from you, Vanessa, that it is an absolute part of the collaborative economy that no money ever changes hands? Is that right?
Well, it depends on what it is, because some of these aspects of the collaborative economy definitely exchange money, and other ones, as you're noting, are not exchanging money. So just to go back to the earlier example, couch surfing is just a non-monetized arrangement. But other things like Zipcar, which has about 2 million members, it's definitely more of a traditional business model. So it really depends on the different kinds of collaborative economy innovations we're seeing.
Okay.
And there's really interesting ones happening in skill sharing as well. Sometimes people just offer up their time to, for example, spend time with someone in the community who might be lonely, or to do something for somebody, for example, to fetch their pharmaceutical, this is, for example, for elderly people, fetching their pharmaceutical order from the pharmacy and bringing it to them. So that can happen in a volunteer basis, but it also can happen through things like TaskRabbit, where we're seeing people offering up their skills for people to pay for those services.
So that'd be something more along the lines of, you build my porch and I'll tutor your kid in math, that type of thing?
Yeah, you can do it that way. You can also actually do it in where people actually put up, I need help in taxes, or I need help in, for example, within a company, I need help in jointly thinking about our legal arrangements here, and people can start to share, for example, legal advice or human resources or security. So you can start to see how you can collaborate on some of these skill sharing platforms. And there's some really interesting ones at the neighborhood scale. For example, people are offering up their part-time time with their dog, for example. So there's obvious ones like childcare, but part-time pooch, which is here in Vancouver, actually says for those people who feel bad about their dog being at home alone during the day, and other people who want to just have a dog part-time, there's also that kind of exchange happening as well.
And presumably it's the internet that allows all this to happen in a way, because there's nothing particularly new about this. People have bartered for goods and services since the beginning of time, but the internet takes it to a whole new level of sophistication. Is that right?
Absolutely. So I think one of the key drivers has been technology. And as you say, it's as old as human civilization. But what's really interesting is that we're seeing that technology allows us to connect with more people with more different assets across larger distances. And that's really exciting because it makes it much more efficient, but allows for that connectivity. And people can find the communities that they can exchange with. So eBay is a classic example of this, but you're also seeing businesses connecting across large distances across Canada. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that I'm involved with is the launch of the National Industrial Symbiosis Program. So these are companies or small and medium-sized enterprises that are sharing some of their underutilized assets or wasted resources. So they might say, I have waste heat, or I have waste energy, or I have materials such as packaging that I don't use after the end of my industrial process. And another business right next door might say, hey, I need waste heat. And we're starting to see those exchanges happening. And it's not just amazing for reducing the amount of resources moving through our economy, but it's also leading to some really great innovations and new business models. So I think there's some really interesting things happening, and a lot of that is supported by the technologies that allow us to watch and find those different ways we can use these assets.
My hunch is if you got money to burn, you don't waste your time with this, but not many people have money to burn. So who actually does this?
Well, it's interesting, actually. It's also for people who don't have enough money. So we're finding that one of the other drivers is that people see this as a way of supplementing their income. So for example, for businesses, it's very inefficient and actually wasteful financially to be throwing certain things away. They have to pay the landfill taxes, et cetera. So they're finding that there's real financial returns and jobs created through this kinds of exchanges, such as industrial symbiosis programs. But at the household level as well, people are renting out their accommodation for income or participating in ride sharing, such as Pogo Ride that's here in Vancouver, and they make a bit of income through that. Or they also save money by not having to purchase things themselves. So for example, a drill, a household drill that you might use, a tool, if you buy it, it's $100. You might use it. Most drills are used for less than 15 minutes in their entire lifespan. So that's a very expensive hole that you're drilling. And so instead, in Vancouver, in Toronto, in other places, people are setting up tool libraries where you can save money and also benefit the environment by not having lots of tools lying around, and just take out the tools you need and return them for collective use. So it actually has financial paybacks. And there's also, of course, the non-monetized thing that we spoke about earlier, where there's exchanges happening on a more connections between people, swapping real time for each other, and more of the gift economy happening as well.
Well, this does get down to the issue, I guess, at the foundation of the whole thing, and that is trust. You got to trust the other guy in order for this to work. How often do people just simply get ripped off because they trust and they shouldn't?
Well, it's actually interesting how little challenges there have been with this type of exchange system, and that has to do with what you're describing, Steve. The trust is happening in two ways. So when people, for example, use a particular service like TaskRabbit, or for example, another one is Zipments, which is a courier system here in Vancouver. And when they use it, then the business says, this was my experience of this shipment being delivered, and Zipman says, this is my experience of the person who asked for it. So it's really interesting. In all of these cases, we're actually seeing that both the business itself, or the community organization, or the person delivering the skills is is giving their assessment of what's happening through technology often. They're saying, I trusted this person and this is what happened. And the person who's using the service or task is also putting in for their assessment of how it went. So what's really interesting is that this is based on reputation and trust. So if somebody is doing something terrible in your accommodation, people find out really quickly. And so what we're finding is that there have been very, very few incidents of that trust being overstepped, because it just the word spread so quickly.
Okay, but
so
having
with
said
all
that,
of the exchanges with it, yeah,
I get you. Having said that, you know, in the real economy, if you overstep, there's government, there's regulations, there's law enforcement, there's a whole host of institutions that are there to keep you on the straight and narrow. Who keeps you on the straight and narrow in this collaborative economy?
That's a great point, and I think you're hitting at the core issue that's really going, which is really perplexing at this moment in the development of the collaborative economy. You know, there's a lot of potential in terms of cities of these underutilized assets, this idling capacity, and we can see lots of ways in which we can create shareable cities. We're also finding that at the city level, there's a lot of regulatory and legal frameworks that are not matching the collaborative economy. So we know how to deal with things like personal ownership or business ownership, but suddenly when we've got these much more collaborative models, we're finding that we're in a kind of gray area in terms of regulation and legal frameworks. And in fact, what's happening is that we need to, in the next 5 years, really think about solutions of how we can spur the innovations that are happening and the kinds of amazing benefits that are coming from the collaborative economy, while also making sure that we're dealing with things like liability, like regulation, like taxation. And so we're seeing innovations. For example, in California, rideshare programs that were bringing people to San Francisco Airport were first just stopped because the taxis had insurance. We knew that they were trustworthy. There was liability insurance in place. And in the first instance, there was none of that. So the first thing that the city government did was just stop. California kind of stopped it from happening. And then now they've created a new legal framework that actually supports those relay riders. So people who are using their own car to give people rides to the airport, they need to go through their own legal and regulatory process in order to become part of the rideshare programs. And so they've put that into place now, but it took a bit of jiggling of the existing regulatory system to figure out how to accommodate this very new innovation.
Vanessa, in our last minute here, I mean, the logical extension of this could be that if it really takes off and everybody does it, we're going to need a whole lot fewer cars, we're going to need a whole lot fewer lawnmowers, we're going to need a whole lot fewer hotels. I mean, the potential for massive unemployment, is the logical extension, the flip side of this whole thing. Should we be concerned about that?
Well, I think you're hitting on a key point, because One Earth, my nonprofit, we're working with cities for people to look at new economies. What's emerging out of these new models? And what we're finding is that in certain places we're seeing a big growth in jobs within this space, and we're also seeing a shift in the fundamentals of the economic model. And so you're quite right, we're moving from just focusing on economics that's about pushing more materials and energy through, and we can't keep doing that on a finite planet. We need to reduce the amount of materials and energy moving through our system and the wasted resources we have, the resources that we're wasting. So what's emerging is a new economic model that is very much about creating a dynamic economics that very much looks at measuring wealth and true costs in a much more rich way.
I get you,
I think you're right.
But there are a hell of a lot of people who are invested in the current economy, not the collaborative economy, and I think you got to speak to them about what could happen to their jobs if suddenly we're buying 80% fewer cars or 80% fewer lawnmowers, et cetera.
Yeah, that's right. So I think what we're going to be looking at is figuring out how to manage this transition. In some cases, we will see a dynamic increase of employment, and in other places, I think we are going to be seeing some industries basically going into a sunset. So I think you're right. One thing we're going to be looking at very very much within Cities for People is how do we actually make that transition so that we have this new economic model that is within the life support system of the planet, that does have equity, that is for social and economic well-being, but that is shifting us away from the current unsustainable economic system that we're in. So I think this collaborative economy actually gives hints of where we might be taking it, and it will take some time to figure out how to do it in a way that makes sure the transition is equitable for all those people who are currently in their existing jobs. And I do think that that transition is possible. We're seeing it happen within these spaces. And the great news is that this collaborative economy is showing a lot of where the innovation space is, where the potentials are for these new economic possibilities. And when we reduce the wasted assets, we all of a sudden release a lot more possibility for reusing those and creating new ways of creating dynamic economics. And that's really what we're looking at within Cities for People.
I hear you, but if I were invested in the old economy, ought I to be worried about what you've got planned here?
Yeah, and you can see it happening in certain places. Like, for example, relay rides, there's a lot of a pushback from the taxi lobby, right? Because, of course, this is directly influencing their jobs. And some of them are becoming relay riders, some of the taxi drivers. But you're quite right, there's a bit of a mess happening in terms of how do we make that transition within that particular industry. But in other places, for example, in looking at actually utilizing wasted resources in a much more efficient way, we're seeing entire new industries emerge. So we can see how when we start to think about a circular economy where we're using materials more than once, there's an entire set of industries that are emerging and jobs that are emerging around reuse, recycling, and reducing, which might seem counterintuitive, but there's a real dynamic industry that's emerging in that, and particularly in things like industrial symbiosis that I was mentioning earlier. So I think it's going to be both. We're going to see in some places there will be a shift in what kinds of employment are happening in one sector as we see a growth in the others.
Understood. Vanessa Timmer, Executive Director and co-founder of One Earth, thanks for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.